Hollywood has always been a place of illusions. The studio lights, the perfectly pressed costumes, the carefully rehearsed smiles, all of it designed to make audiences fall in love with a version of reality that never quite existed. But every now and then, someone from inside that world steps forward and refuses to let the curtain stay drawn. Paul Newman was one of those rare people. Newman spent more than 5 decades inside the Hollywood machine. He won awards, built friendships, and earned the kind of respect that most actors spend their entire careers chasing. But he also saw things. Things that didn't make it into the trades, things that publicists buried before breakfast, and things that studio executives quietly paid to disappear. And unlike many of his peers, Newman had the moral backbone to occasionally speak about what he witnessed, in interviews, in private conversations, and in off-the-record moments that slowly, over the years, found their way into the public consciousness. What follows is a journey through the darker corridors of Hollywood's so-called Golden Age. These are not stories built on gossip alone. They are drawn from memoirs, court records, journalist investigations, and first-hand testimonies from people who lived through them. And through it all, Paul Newman's voice echoes, sometimes as a witness, sometimes as a conscience, and always as a reminder that talent and fame are never, on their own, proof of decency. There are few contradictions in Hollywood history as disturbing as Joan Crawford. On screen, she was commanding, magnetic, and undeniably gifted. Off-screen, behind the wrought iron gates of her Brentwood mansion, a very different story was unfolding, one that the industry worked extremely hard to keep hidden for decades. Crawford won her Academy Award for Mildred Pierce in 1946, a film in which, with deep irony, she played a devoted and sacrificing mother. The ceremony was a triumph. The press fawned. Fan mail flooded in. But those closest to Crawford knew that the woman clutching that Oscar was living a double life of staggering proportions. Her adopted daughter Christina Crawford eventually broke the silence in her 1978 memoir Mommy Dearest, one of the most harrowing accounts of childhood abuse ever published by a Hollywood insider. Christina described a home governed not by love but by fear, where clothes hangers were used as instruments of punishment, where midnight inspections of closets could descend into violence, and where emotional cruelty was woven into the fabric of daily life. The memoir shocked the public, but it did not surprise those within the industry who had long heard whispers about Crawford's behavior behind closed doors. Paul Newman, reflecting on Crawford's legacy, reportedly remarked that Hollywood had a remarkable talent for mistaking performance for personality. Crawford's entire public persona was itself a performance, and it was one she maintained with extraordinary discipline. The tragedy, Newman suggested, was that the children in her home had no choice but to live with the woman behind that performance. What makes the Crawford story particularly unsettling is the way the industry rallied around her public image, even as private truths circulated. Studio executives knew. Journalists suspected. But Crawford was box office, and box office, in Hollywood's golden age, was sacred. The system didn't just fail to protect her children, it actively constructed a mythology around their abuser. Christina's account was corroborated over the years by household staff, family acquaintances, and others who had witnessed the dysfunction firsthand. Crawford's will, which explicitly excluded Christina and her brother Christopher with the pointed phrase, "for reasons which they well know," was seen by many as a final act of cruelty from beyond the grave. It was the last line in a story written entirely by a woman who needed to control every narrative, including her own ending. If Joan Crawford represented the darkness hiding behind Hollywood glamour, Bing Crosby represented something perhaps even more insidious, the darkness hiding behind wholesomeness. Crawford, at least, had an edge to her public persona. Crosby was warmth itself. He was the crooner who made the world feel safe, whose voice on the radio felt like a fireplace on a winter evening. And that image made the truth all the more difficult to confront. Crosby's eldest son Gary shattered that image definitively in his 1983 memoir Going My Own Way, published with visible anguish and remarkable courage. Gary described a father who ruled his household through intimidation and physical punishment, a man whose belt was as familiar to his children as his famous baritone. The warmth that millions heard in Crosby's recordings was, according to Gary, entirely absent from a man who came home at night. The psychological toll on the Crosby children was catastrophic and well documented. 2 of his sons from his first marriage, Lindsay and Dennis, died by suicide, Lindsay in 1989 and Dennis in 1991. The grief and trauma embedded in those tragedies is impossible to separate from what Gary described about their upbringing. These were not men who had found peace. These were men who had carried unbearable weight. Journalists and biographers who investigated Crosby's life in subsequent decades found that his behavior was not entirely unknown to the industry during his lifetime. It was simply inconvenient. Crosby was one of the most commercially valuable figures in American entertainment, in music, in film, and on radio simultaneously. He was a one-man economy, and the infrastructure built around him had enormous incentive to protect the brand. Newman's perspective on Crosby cut to the heart of this hypocrisy. The idea that Crosby's abuse could be explained away by his own difficult upbringing was something Newman rejected. Plenty of people survive hard childhoods without raising their hands against their children. The choice to use violence, Newman believed, was exactly that, a choice, and one rooted in the desire to dominate. The fact that Crosby made that choice while simultaneously projecting an image of fatherly love to millions of Americans is what made his story not just sad, but genuinely sinister. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s like a character from one of his own swashbuckling films, impossibly handsome, effortlessly charismatic, and seemingly untouchable. His performances in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood made him one of the biggest stars in the world. And his off-screen reputation for reckless living only seemed to enhance his appeal, at least to those who weren't paying close enough attention. In 1942, Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving two underage girls, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley. The trial was a sensation. The courtroom overflowed, the press ran wild, and the public was split between those who were horrified and those who, astonishingly, treated the whole thing as further evidence of Flynn's roguish magnetism. He was ultimately acquitted, but the circumstances of that acquittal, which involved a sympathetic jury, powerful studio intervention, and what several journalists described as a carefully managed narrative, left serious questions unanswered. What the trial exposed, more than anything, was the architecture of protection that surrounded powerful men in Hollywood. Studios controlled access to information. They cultivated relationships with journalists who understood that their careers depended on cooperation. They employed fixers whose entire job was to make uncomfortable truths disappear. Flynn benefited from all of it. Biographers who later examined Flynn's life in detail, including Charles Hyam in his controversial 1980 biography, painted a portrait of a man whose appetites were both voracious and deeply troubling, and whose wealth and fame insulated him almost entirely from consequence. The parties at his Hollywood Hills home were legendary, and not in a celebratory sense. Former associates described an environment where boundaries were non-existent, and where the power imbalance between Flynn and the young women in his orbit was extreme. Paul Newman, who had known people who moved in Flynn's circles, was reportedly deeply disturbed by the way the industry's memory of Flynn was curated after his death in 1959. The films were preserved and celebrated. The trial was treated as a footnote, a youthful scandal rather than a window into something genuinely predatory. Newman understood that the way Hollywood chose to remember its legends was itself a moral statement, and in Flynn's case, it was a statement that chose mythology over accountability. Mickey Rooney was, by almost any measure, one of the most talented performers Hollywood has ever produced. As a child and young adult, he was extraordinary, a singer, a dancer, a comedian, and a dramatic actor, all wrapped in one hyperactive, irrepressible package. MGM promoted him relentlessly, and for a stretch in the late 1930s, he was the biggest box office draw in the entire industry. But talent has never been a reliable indicator of character, and those who worked closely with Rooney during his peak years frequently described a man whose behavior off-camera was troubling in ways that the studio worked hard to manage and conceal. His temper was volatile. His treatment of colleagues, particularly those with less power than himself, was described by multiple accounts as abusive and bullying. The distance between the charming, lovable persona projected on screen and the reality experienced by those around him was considerable. Rooney's personal life was chaotic on a scale that even Hollywood found difficult to ignore. He married 8 times. He accumulated and squandered enormous wealth. And in his later years, he became the subject of a conservatorship battle with members of his own family, a deeply painful public unraveling for a man who had once been the industry's most beloved figure. What gives the Rooney story its particular weight is the way it illustrates the MGM system at its most controlling. The studio invested heavily in his image. It suppressed stories. It managed his press. And in doing so, it enabled behavior that might otherwise have faced consequences. The protection that MGM extended to Rooney was not unique. It was standard practice, but it was, in retrospect, a profound failure of institutional responsibility. Newman's comments on Rooney over the years were measured but pointed. He understood that Rooney was in many ways a product of a system that had failed him from childhood, thrust into fame and wealth before he had the tools to handle either, but he also believed that understanding context was different from offering absolution. Bette Davis is one of the genuine legends of American cinema. Her performances in films like All About Eve, Now Voyager, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane remain benchmarks of the craft. She was fiercely intelligent, technically brilliant, and utterly committed to her work in ways that few of her contemporaries could match. She was also, by virtually every account, extraordinarily difficult to work with, and in ways that went beyond the acceptable eccentricities of creative temperament. Colleagues described a woman who could be deliberately cruel, who seemed to find satisfaction in humiliating those with less power, and whose aggression on set occasionally crossed from psychological into physical territory. Her legendarily hostile relationship with Joan Crawford during the production of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962 has been extensively documented, most recently in Ryan Murphy's television series and the source material it drew upon. But Crawford was not the only person on the receiving end of Davis's aggression. Character actors, crew members, and younger performers all described an atmosphere around Davis that was, at its worst, genuinely hostile. Davis was in many ways a woman who had fought brutally hard in an industry that consistently underestimated and disrespected women, and some of her aggression can be understood in that context. She pushed back against a system that wanted to control her, and she paid significant professional prices for doing so. But understanding the roots of behavior is different from excusing its impact. The people Davis targeted were often those with the least power to defend themselves, which places her cruelty in a different moral category than simple, artistic stubbornness. Newman, who had witnessed Davis in action during his own years in the industry, acknowledged her extraordinary talent without reservation. But he also believed that talent did not function as moral currency, that it could not be exchanged for permission to treat other human beings with contempt. Kirk Douglas built one of Hollywood's most enduring legacies, a career defined by physical intensity, moral complexity on screen, and a public commitment to causes that included standing up to the McCarthy-era blacklist by openly crediting blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo on Spartacus. That act of professional courage was real and significant. It made enemies and it mattered. But Douglas's legacy is also shadowed by allegations that began circulating in private during his peak years and have gained wider public attention in more recent decades. The most serious of these involve Natalie Wood, who was one of the most significant figures in 1950s Hollywood. Wood's sister Lana, in her memoir Little Sister, described a deeply troubling incident from 1954 when Natalie was just 15 years old. According to Lana's account, Natalie returned from an arranged meeting with Douglas visibly distressed and emotionally shaken. Natalie herself, in conversations later in her life, apparently alluded to the incident to close friends, though she maintained a public silence about it. The circumstances, as they have been reconstructed, fit a pattern of behavior that multiple women from that era described in connection with Douglas, powerful men using professional access and the machinery of the studio system as tools of exploitation. The fact that Douglas was honored with the Medal of Freedom and an honorary Oscar and lived to the age of 103 as a celebrated patriarch of Hollywood history is not necessarily evidence that the allegations are wrong. It may simply be evidence of how effectively the system protected its most valued assets. Paul Newman, in one of his more direct statements about the culture of Hollywood, suggested that the honors the industry gave to itself were often more revealing of its priorities than of the actual characters of the people receiving them. Marlene Dietrich was one of the most singular presences in the history of cinema. Born in Berlin, she carried with her a European sensibility that Hollywood found simultaneously irresistible and slightly dangerous. Her performances in films like Morocco and Witness for the prosecution demonstrated genuine range and intelligence. Her personal magnetism was, by all accounts, almost supernatural. But Dietrich's relationships, with men and women alike, were frequently described by those who lived through them as exercises in power and control rather than genuine intimacy. Her daughter Maria Riva's extraordinarily detailed 1992 memoir, Marlene Dietrich, painted a portrait of a woman who treated the people in her life as instruments for her own purposes, discarding them when they ceased to be useful, with a coldness that shocked even those who believed they understood her. The list of people who emerged from their involvement